I think the Morricone style is indefinable. He came out of a tradition of the avant-garde. He was writing a lot of avant-garde music in the late 50s, and he brought that sensibility, I think, to those films. He started scoring films in 1961. Fistful was done in 1964. He'd really only done about a half dozen films at that time, although he was classically trained and had a second career as a pop arranger in the late 50s and early 60s. So he brought to films a wide range of experience in musical endeavor in Italy. And that clearly served him well for the kinds of offbeat and or very original music that he would write for the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. When Leone was in post-production on A Fistful of Dollars, the producers had suggested to him that they consider using Ennio Morricone, who had just finished a score for another film that they were doing, Gunfight at Red Sands. And the two of them, I think, hit it off early on. I think in part because Leone did not want the traditional symphonic Western score, which I think he felt had ruined a lot of great Western movies. He specifically wanted something fresh, original, unusual, and Morricone was poised to deliver that. The great thing about the Western scores, I think, is the unusual nature of the themes and the orchestrations. They range from offbeat vocal effects to traditional symphonic sounds to the most bizarre and offbeat use of unusual instruments and choir and choral effects. In fact, the main theme that became kind of a hit out of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly has a kind of coyote howl in it. Morricone has talked about it on a handful of occasions, and in fact, the which figures so strongly and prominently throughout the score, I think was inspired by the natural animal sounds that Leone had used, particularly in the opening segment of the picture. But it was one facet of an overall tapestry that made the score for The Good, the Bad, the Ugly one of the most original and unusual of the 60s. In the case of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, he did, in fact, write some music before production began. That was not the case on Fistful of Dollars when he came in late during post-production, or on For a Few Dollars More, although there was some talk about music before the film. I don't believe that he actually wrote much, if anything, for A Few Dollars More before production began. But that was not the case on The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, where Leone and Morricone had met early on, talked about musical concepts, and Morricone actually did write some music in advance of shooting. Notably, the now famous Ecstasy of Gold sequence, where Tuco arrives at the cemetery and he is almost insane with joy at finally finding the place where the gold is. I think it's very clear that Leone had music in mind and may in fact have been playing Morricone's early demo version of that score on the set and had that in mind as he was shooting. Try to imagine that sequence without that score. That score propels you through that entire sequence. Leone said that it was played on the set. It's interesting that the actors don't seem to remember that. I know that Eastwood has said that he doesn't remember that happening. But Leone was quite firm, and so was Morricone, about saying that, in fact, there was music recorded in advance and that some of it was played on the set. The same is true for the sequence that follows, as the trio sort of face off in the cemetery and the ultimate shootout takes place. I think that Leone had planned those sequences in advance with music in mind. I think it's hard to say now, some years later, how specifically he shot them to musical ideas. I think The Good and the Bad and the Ugly became the template for their later relationship, their later professional collaboration. In every case, they met in advance. Morricone had read the script, they sat down and discussed musical ideas, and virtually all major themes were composed with Leone's approval prior to shooting. The result of that collaboration made those scores all better in many ways. It allowed the composer time to think. It gave Leone what he wanted in advance, and if he chose to play that material on the set, as he almost always did, it gave him sort of musical inspiration as he was shooting. And then Morricone would come in later and actually hone those themes and specifically scored a picture. I think that Leone thought on an operatic basis. I suspect that he was a larger-than-life figure himself, and I think he brought that sensibility to all of his films. It's Morricone's music that helps to lift them into that operatic vein. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was influential in many ways. Some composers actually tried to sort of rip off the concepts, the unusual orchestration, the vocal effects, that sort of thing. And certainly I think it opened the door for some composers to think on a broader scale, to think outside of the traditional symphonic writing. But at the end of the day, really only Morricone could pull off that kind of unusual combination of musical effects. Although other composers tried to imitate and emulate some things that Morricone did, really it was his style, and I think it was hard for anybody else to really pull off.